ABC General Hospital spoilers for Friday, March 27 reveal that, at the same time, Gio made a decision that would quietly disturb the fragile order even further. He sought out Dante not as a casual observer, not as someone passing along harmless concern, but as a man who had seen enough emotional damage to know when another man was slipping toward a dangerous edge. Dante had been carrying too much pressure for too long. His instincts as an investigator were in conflict with his identity as a father, and every new inconsistency in the story around him only deepened that fracture. Gio could see it in the way Dante's restraint had started hardening into bitterness. There was rage in him now, but it was controlled rage, the kind that often becomes most destructive because it waits for the right target. Gio understood that Dante was not merely frustrated by missing facts. He was wounded by exclusion. He felt locked out of truths connected to people who should have trusted him most. And when a man like Dante begins to believe he has been deliberately shut out, his pain does not stay private for long. It becomes action. Gio's visit was not innocent in its effect, even if it began with concern. By drawing close to Dante, by offering him a place to focus his growing suspicion, he unintentionally sharpened Dante's obsession with finding the missing piece. Dante had already begun to suspect that several people around him were lying by omission. But hearing his own unease reflected back through another person's eyes only intensified his resolve. It made him feel less paranoid and more justified. That was the turning point. Dante stopped telling himself he might be imagining things. He began telling himself that the deception was real, targeted, and unforgivable. His thoughts turned darker. If Lulu was hiding information, then she was not merely protecting someone. She was choosing someone else over him. If Jason had manipulated events again, then he was interfering in Dante's rights as both an officer and a father. If the younger people around them were already being drawn into these layers of secrecy, then the damage had spread further than anyone wanted to admit. Gio did not create Dante's anger, but he gave it shape. He helped turn raw emotion into suspicion with direction, and that made everything more dangerous. Michael saw all of this unfolding with growing alarm. Unlike Sonny, whose anger came from the demand to reassert control, Michael's caution came from bitter experience. He knew what happened when family members convinced themselves that secrecy was protection. He knew how quickly righteous motives could turn toxic when layered with pride, fear, and long memory, so while others rushed toward confrontation, Michael held back and watched. He noticed the way Sonny's questions were becoming more aggressive, the way Jocelyn's confidence seemed almost too polished, the way Lulu's attention had sharpened into something secretive, and the way Dante's emotional restraint looked increasingly close to collapse. Michael had no illusions about his own family. He knew they were capable of turning love into pressure and concern into control. That knowledge made him cautious to the point of isolation. His wariness was not weakness, it was survival. Michael understood that whatever was coming next would not be a clean conflict between heroes and villains. It would be a layered implosion in which everyone would claim to be acting for the right reasons while causing damage they could never fully repair. He had seen Sonny justify destructive choices in the name of family too many times. He had watched Carly, Jason, and others bend truth until it became almost meaningless. And now he was beginning to see the next generation absorb the same instincts. Jocelyn was offering deals, Dante was hardening into suspicion, Lulu was conducting her own private investigation. Even Gio, perhaps without meaning to, had inserted himself into emotional territory that could easily explode. Michael did not trust the shape of any of it. That was why he became guarded, why his every expression carried restraint, why he seemed to be bracing for betrayal before it even fully arrived. He was not simply cautious about facts. He was cautious about what people became when cornered. That caution put him at odds with Sonny almost immediately. Sonny wanted action, clarity, loyalty, and visible alignment. Michael offered none of those things easily. He had questions of his own, and worse, he had doubts about Sonny's ability to handle the truth without making the situation bloodier. This created a deep and painful divide between father and son. Sonny interpreted Michael's reserve as judgment. Michael interpreted Sonny's intensity as proof that the old cycle was beginning again. Neither man was entirely wrong. That was what made the tension between them so tragic. Sonny still believed force could stabilize a collapsing situation. Michael had already learned that force often accelerates collapse. Their conflict was not merely about information. It was about worldview, about whether family survives through control or through restraint, and about whether either man still had the emotional credibility to lead when everything around them was turning poisonous. As these tensions deepened, Port Charles began to feel like a city on the verge of choosing sides. Dante grew more suspicious with every passing hour, and Gio's involvement gave him just enough emotional reinforcement to keep pushing. Lulu kept digging, and with every new discovery, she became less willing to trust that anyone else would protect her family the right way. Jocelyn's offer began circulating through quiet channels, tempting people who were desperate enough to accept help without asking what it might cost later. Michael remained on alert, reading the room like a man watching cracks spread across glass, and Sonny, at the center of it all, felt his authority slipping into a field of competing intentions. That loss of control hit him harder than he wanted to admit. For a man who had built his life on commanding outcomes, there was something almost unbearable about realizing that everyone around him had begun making private moves. The emotional violence of the moment did not come from weapons or physical attacks. It came from motive colliding with motive. Sonny wanted truth, but also obedience. Dante wanted justice, but also personal vindication. Lulu wanted answers, but also protection. Jocelyn wanted influence, but also recognition. Michael wanted caution, but also distance from the family patterns he feared were repeating. None of them were operating from a clean moral center. All of them were driven by wounds, memories, pride, and fear. That was why the situation felt so combustible. Everyone believed they were responding to danger, but several of them were also creating it. Every attempt to get ahead of the crisis only fed the crisis further. And behind it all was the deeper poison that always threatens Port Charles, the belief that truth can be managed. Sonny believed he could pull the right answers out of people through pressure. Lulu believed she could uncover enough on her own to stay ahead of disaster. Jocelyn believed a well-timed offer could control the outcome. Dante believed persistence would force the lie to crack. Michael alone seemed to understand that once too many people begin manipulating reality for their own reasons, the truth no longer arrives in a form anyone can handle. It arrives shattered, dragging collateral damage behind it. That was the real dread settling over everyone now. Not simply that secrets existed, but that too many people were moving at once to exploit, conceal, or weaponize them. What comes next will not be gentle. Sonny's demands will force someone into a choice they are not ready to make. Gio's connection to Dante will deepen the emotional urgency of an investigation that is already becoming personal. Jocelyn's offer will place at least one desperate person in her debt, and that debt will come back sharper than expected. Lulu's search will expose truths that do not bring relief, only more reasons to distrust the people around her. Michael's caution will be mistaken for disloyalty, isolating him further until his silence becomes its own kind of statement. And once those forces collide, Port Charles will not just be dealing with one mystery or one betrayal. It will be facing the beginning of a broader fracture inside the very families who have spent years telling themselves they survive anything together. But survival is not the same as healing, and that may be the harshest truth of all. These people know how to endure scandal, violence, and heartbreak. What they do not know how to do is stop turning every wound into another secret struggle for control. Sonny cannot demand loyalty forever without breeding rebellion. Dante cannot chase truth as if emotion will politely stay out of the way. Lulu cannot search for answers without risking becoming as manipulative as the people she resents. Jocelyn cannot step into the adult game and expect to emerge morally untouched. Michael cannot remain permanently watchful without eventually being forced to choose a side. One by one, they are all being pushed toward the kind of decision that reveals who they really are when love and fear stop cooperating. So the city waits, tense and restless, while the next crack forms. Sonny is demanding answers because he knows something is rotting beneath the surface. Gio is seeking Dante because he senses that rage without direction becomes destruction. Jocelyn is making offers because she has decided influence is safer than innocence. Lulu is hunting information because ignorance now feels like surrender. Michael is staying wary because he has seen too many family wars begin with the same promise, that the lie is temporary, that the secret is necessary, that the damage can be contained. In Port Charles, those promises never hold for long. The explosion is coming. The only question is who will still recognize themselves after it does. The air in Port Charles had changed. It no longer felt like a city moving through its usual cycle of secrets, betrayals, and temporary alliances. It felt heavier, sharper, as if too many people were carrying too many lies at once and the strain was starting to tear through the surface. The silence after recent chaos had not brought peace. It had only created a more dangerous kind of tension, the kind that settles into homes, hospital corridors, police offices, and waterfront shadows until everyone begins speaking more carefully, watching more closely, and preparing for impact without admitting it. This was no longer a moment of confusion. It was the beginning of a deeper war, one built not just on what had happened, but on who now wanted answers, who wanted leverage, and who was willing to use fear as a weapon. Sonny was the first to feel that the balance had shifted too far. He had lived too long in a world of calculated violence, not to recognize when the story in front of him was incomplete. Too many names kept circling the same crisis. Too many frightened faces were connected to events that did not line up cleanly. Jason was under pressure, Dante was increasingly agitated, Lulu was moving in silence, and Jocelyn was beginning to involve herself in ways Sonny found deeply unsettling. He had spent years believing that experience gave him a kind of instinct no one else could match, and now that instinct was screaming that the people closest to him were either being manipulated or were making reckless decisions they could not control. What Sonny could not tolerate was uncertainty inside his own circle. Uncertainty led to weakness, weakness led to mistakes, and mistakes in Port Charles had a way of turning into funerals. That was why he stopped waiting for updates, stopped accepting fragments, and began demanding the truth with a force that made everyone around him uncomfortable. His anger was not loud at first. That was what made it more dangerous. Sonny's calm had always been more frightening than his shouting, because it meant he was no longer reacting emotionally. He was assessing, narrowing his focus, deciding who had failed him and who might still be useful. He wanted answers about the chain of events that had pushed Jason into yet another impossible position. He wanted to know why Dante's behavior had become so volatile, why Lulu was suddenly harder to read, why Jocelyn was hovering around the edges of matters that could destroy her if she stepped too far in, and why Michael seemed to be watching everyone, as if he expected betrayal to come from within the family itself. Sonny sensed the formation of competing agendas, and that was what truly infuriated him. He could handle external enemies. He had done that his entire life. What he could not stand was the possibility that inside the people he loved, fear and ambition had begun pulling in opposite directions. Then there was Jocelyn, moving with the unnerving confidence of someone who had been surrounded by power games long enough to stop fearing them. She approached the crisis from a different angle. While others were busy drowning in emotion, Jocelyn was already thinking in terms of leverage, timing, and controlled risk. She had watched too many adults in Port Charles destroy themselves by reacting impulsively, and she had learned the wrong lesson from it. Instead of rejecting manipulation, she had become increasingly willing to use it if it meant staying ahead. So when she made an offer, it was not a simple gesture of support. It was a proposition loaded with strategy. She saw opportunities in the fractures opening between Sonny, Michael, Lulu, Dante, and Jason. She saw information moving unevenly, loyalties straining, and panic making people vulnerable. In a city like Port Charles, that meant someone bold could step in and alter the board before the older players noticed. Jocelyn's offer carried the seductive danger of youthful certainty. She believed she could help contain the situation, redirect suspicion, and protect the people she cared about, while also proving that she was no longer someone to be dismissed or shielded. But beneath that confidence was something more personal. Jocelyn was tired of being treated like an outsider to the real battles. She was tired of being the one adults worried about while making catastrophic decisions of their own. Her offer was not just strategic. It was rebellious. It was her way of forcing herself into the center of the story, demanding relevance and claiming power in a world where power always came stained. The tragedy was that she may not have fully understood the cost. Every offer in Port Charles comes attached to a debt, and the moment Jocelyn stepped in, she placed herself in the path of consequences she might not yet be ruthless enough to survive. Lulu, meanwhile, had moved beyond shock and entered a colder, more deliberate phase. She had spent enough time drowning in fear, guilt, and emotional confusion. Now something else was rising in her, a relentless need to know exactly how much danger surrounded her family and who was pulling the strings behind the scenes. Lulu had learned the hard way that waiting for men like Dante, Sonny, or Jason to reveal the whole truth was a form of surrender. She could no longer afford surrender. Too many lives were being rearranged by secrets already. So she began searching for information on her own, quietly, carefully, and with a desperation that made her more reckless than she wanted to admit. She started following loose threads, revisiting details others had dismissed, questioning patterns in behavior, timing, and silence. What had once looked like scattered crises now began to resemble something more coordinated, or at least more deeply intertwined than anyone was openly saying. This search changed Lulu. The more she learned, the less innocent her motives became. At first, she told herself she was only protecting the people she loved, but protection in Port Charles rarely remains pure. Once Lulu began uncovering how much had been hidden from her, anger started replacing fear. She was angry at Dante for the pressure he was putting on everyone, without understanding the full emotional damage already done. She was angry at Jason for existing at the center of these storms so often that everyone else kept getting dragged under. She was angry at Sonny for always pulling the emotional weather of the city around himself, and then acting shocked when others made secret decisions in response. Most of all, she was angry at the cruel structure of a situation in which every truth seemed capable of destroying someone. Her search for information was no longer only defensive. It became an act of rebellion against being handled, managed, and kept in the dark. That made her sharper, but it also made her harder. The more she discovered, the more willing she became to use knowledge as a weapon if cornered.